move on to our second proposition speaker, Mr. Lawson-Cruttenden. Thank you.
I'm pleased to say I can find two things in common with Mr. Bra. The first thing is, he talked about the need to fight for socialism. On this side, we are the living example of egalitarianism, because my proposer is a lieutenant general, and there's me, a mere lieutenant. So here we are, we believe in egalitarianism on our side. And the second matter that Mr. Brown mentioned was Oliver Cromwell. Well, Oliver Cromwell was my favourite person. He went to my college. His DNA is in me. Now, I want to look at this. There are 4 key words here, aren't there, in this debate. And the key words are this house, us, fight, queen, and country. 4 words really: house, fight, queen, and country. And I'm going to suggest to you that here we don't fight for a cause, we fight for our sovereign. And it's as simple as that. And I'm going to suggest to you that the process by which we in this country fight for our sovereign is both democratic and lawful. And it's deeply embedded in a democratic and lawful process. And I speak to you now as, I know I'm billed as a court-martial lawyer, but I speak to you as a human rights lawyer. And I'm going to suggest that the way in which we go to war, conduct wars, and deal with them afterwards is deeply involved, and it's subject to both our democratic and our judicial processes, which are effective. Now the first, so I'm going to break this down into 5 points. Right? The way in which we declare war, 1, the position of our sovereign, 2, our country, 3, the obligation to fight, 4, and the concept of a just war. And I'm going to conclude. Now when we declare hostilities, now we've obviously, I think we're all probably au fait with the Jerry Adams debate going on at the moment. Jerry Adams, the MP that never sat in the House of Commons, he's happy to draw the salary, but he wouldn't do the work. Well, that's maybe an emotive way of doing it, because we know that in order, he wouldn't sit in the House because he wouldn't swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen. And of course the key concept of this country is we have a sovereign in Parliament. And so we have this very careful checks and balances in our society. And this is reflected when we go to war. Right, when we go to war, as you know, the Prime Minister declares war. And it's his call. And we know from the Chilcot inquiry, we're sort of deeply examining whether or not Tony Blair was right to go to war in Iraq. And of course the jury's out on that. But the Prime Minister declares war, and he does so in the name of the Queen, and they exercise, between the two of them, the royal prerogative, and the royal prerogative, we know, is the customary or common law which vests in the sovereign. So that's on the one hand. And the authority for the declaration of war clearly lies with the sovereign. But because we have a constitutional monarchy, then the sovereign cannot declare war, and after all, it's the sovereign we're going to war for, because this motion is, we're going to fight for our Queen, so we go to war for our sovereign. But because we have a constitutional monarchy, she can only declare war, the Queen, through the Prime Minister. Now the Prime Minister can only declare war if he has the confidence of the House of Commons. So there's our check and our balance. So we have this mix, constitutional monarchy, which obviously came in courtesy, I suppose, of Oliver Cromwell, because with the Restoration in 1660, well, we have this checks and balances, the royal prerogative and Parliament. Now, it cannot be said that when this country goes to war, it cannot be said that we're not being democratic. Because every time we go to war, it is a democratic decision. Now, you could say, Winston Churchill said, of course, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those that went before it. And of course, democracy isn't great, and we have parliamentary democracy. But the first thing, if I'm going to ask you to vote for our side, I'm asking you to do something that is fundamentally democratic. And I say, 1, it is democratic. Secondly, the Queen. And I said to you earlier, and this motion is, will we fight for Queen and country? So what is the relationship with the Queen? Well, it's a very simple one, and it's based on an oath of loyalty. So at the coronation, you know, the Queen swears to govern us according to our laws and customs. And we as her subjects, and when I say subjects, I mean anyone who's British, a member of the Commonwealth, or associated with the British Commonwealth. So we had an Australian soldier who got a VC recently. He owes his oath of loyalty to the Queen. Anyone, therefore, we all owe our oath of loyalty to the Queen, and the Queen exercises her authority through the Crown and Parliament. So if we look at the second system, the Queen, she is, in law, she's answerable to Parliament, she has to act lawfully. We cannot accept an order from the Queen which is unlawful, and she is subject to parliamentary scrutiny. So I say my second heading, the Queen, is the Queen part of the democratic process? If I fight for the Queen, am I being democratic and lawful? I say to you, yes, because she is subject to law and I'm subject to law. And in essence, I say the relationship is simple. Right? I am, probably like most people, a simple person. And if the Queen's job is to run the government and to make sure the government is democratic and lawful, my job is to owe her faithful and true allegiance. And so it just becomes a simple relationship. And of course I think that, so that's my second point. So my third point then is, we're going to fight as a country, are we going to fight? And I think the most important thing, I think we're beginning to lose it, we are not citizens. This is a European concept. Right? We are subjects. And we are subjects to the Crown. And the Crown is the embodiment. We don't really have a nation as such. Our nation vests in the Crown. The Crown is the embodiment of the state, the Constitution, and more importantly, the rule of law. So I have a simple proposition, which is, if the Queen says to me, you must fight for your country, then I say, yes, I must go, because I owe her my oath of allegiance. And I say that there's these reciprocal rights. I have great privileges being a subject, great privileges living in this country, but with that do go the responsibilities. And the ultimate responsibility is to fight for freedom if it's necessary. Now, my fourth point, the obligation to fight. Now that is it's a very difficult one. And we've mentioned, the General mentioned, the First World War and the grave problems that people had in 1933 and the carnage on the Western Front. And I'm going to refer you to two great war poets, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. And the interesting thing about both those war poets is they were very close to embracing pacifism. And yet, despite embracing pacifism, they decided to go back to fight. And you probably know Siegfried Sassoon survived, and Wilfred Owen died in the last 4 weeks of the First World War. But Siegfried Sassoon is probably quite famous for, I expect most of you have read the book Regeneration by Pat Barker, and she talks about the way in which he wrote his willful letter of defiance. So I'm going to read part of it. It's very apt. And he actually wrote a letter of defiance in 1916 when he was wounded back in this country. He said this, I'm writing this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. He then goes on, I'm a soldier, convinced I'm acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defence and liberation, has now become an act of aggression and conquest. And of course, Pat Barker in her book deals with the way in which the army didn't dare court-martial him. The great problem they had is that if he'd gone to court, he could actually have proved his case, because a lot of people believed in 1916 the First World War had lost its way. But the important thing about Siegfried Sassoon was that he went back to fight. And he went back to fight because he believed that his duty to his country took precedence over his personal views about the war. So I go back to my original premise. I'm a subject of the Queen. I owe my oath of allegiance to the Queen. If she says go for it, I go for it. And whatever my views are, I have to follow. And that's the way it is and the way it should be. Now, Wilfred Owen is another person who expressed amazingly pacifist views. And I think it's a great testimony to the period of the time that they could cope with these war poets and they could cope with these views and yet still not just get on with life. And he actually tells a story, I don't know if you know the poem, Parable of the Old Men and the Young. And he takes this parable from the story in Genesis when Abraham was required by God to sacrifice Isaac. And we know that Isaac's life was reprieved by the ram that appeared. And of course he then says, but not so the people who are dying in the First World War. And he actually, the last 3 lines of this poem, Parable of the Old Men and the Young, is this: offer the ram of pride instead of Isaac, but the old man would not so, but slew his son and half the seed of Europe, one by one. Now, if that isn't amazingly, that's an amazing pacifist statement by an officer in the First World War. That's his true views, but his duty comes first, and he actually goes and he dies 4 weeks before the end of the war. And I suppose when I was thinking about this, I thought, you echo, that this is the spirit, I suppose, of the Charge of the Light Brigade, isn't it? Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. And I'm afraid there are times when that's what you have to do. And there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country who have done that. They've not asked the questions, they've done it because they had to do it. Now my fifth point then is just war concept, because I don't think we can really look at this issue, the House would fight for Queen and Country, without considering the concept of just war. And so I'm going to offer it quickly from Thomas Aquinas, our 13th century Dominican. And he gave 3 principles of a just war. And I think they are, I mean, I've said that what we do in this country, when we go to war, when we wage it, I submit that what we do is democratic and it's lawful. But we do have to have regard to this concept of just war. And I know those opposing us have actually said that if you're fighting a war for imperialism or for against socialism or whatever, that may not come within this criteria. I leave you to decide. We're not talking about any particular war. But the first principle is the war must be started and controlled by the authority of state. That's the first principle of Aquinas. So he rather discounted civil wars or wars of revolution. He says there must be a just cause, point 2. He says, point 3, the war must be for good against evil. Law and order must always be restored. And the Catholic Church brought in 2 postscripts. The war must be of last resort, it must be proportional. So if I then conclude, we know that the jury is out on the Iraq War, and we're obviously listening to the Chilcot inquiry. But however, I say that there's a pleasing symmetry between the concept of just war theory by Aquinas, which I think is still valid, and the way in which we wage war in this country. And Aquinas' doctrine is still there. I mean, we have head of state, the Queen, we fight for. She makes a decision democratically. There's a dominance of law in how we fight our wars. There's a heavy accountability, both to parliamentary scrutiny, Chilcot inquiry, court-martials, international courts, the lot. And lastly, I'd say that if we in this House are not prepared ever to fight for our Queen and Country, then we completely lose deterrence. Because deterrence is ultimately the only thing that's going to really keep us going. I mean, when Galtieri invaded the Falklands, he thought we were going to let it go. And had he known that we weren't going to let it go, he wouldn't have invaded. I'm going to leave you with one final thought, and I'm going to risk being dated, racist and sexist. But I'm going to... But Lord Nelson, of course, wasn't bound by political correctness. And at Trafalgar, he said, right, England expects every man should do his duty.